Hello and welcome back to another episode of Victorian Engines. Now I'd like to add this little disclaimer that I don't really think rail motors are locomotives in the sense. However, this is part of the Victorian engine series, and I'm just going to lump the rail motors in with the actual locomotives. So, with that out of the way, may I present to you the Victorian Railways DERM, or as we all call it, the Derm. The railways of the 20th century are more known for their giant, flashy and expensive steam and diesel locomotives. If I say LNER or New York Central, you'd think of their big, speedy and Art Deco Pacifics and Streamliners. Railways, however, covered large areas. Often these areas are short and sparse branch lines where normal loco-hauled services are very expensive. The concept of the rail motor began in the UK around the turn of 1850. The idea of fusing together the locomotive and passenger-carrying rolling stock into one functional machine was a very popular idea, and soon these rail motors, as they were deemed, were being built across the United Kingdom. However, early steam-powered rail motors were unreliable and not very useful, but as technology progressed, so did the idea of the rail motor. During the early 20th century, the Australian railway company Victorian Railways experimented with many different rail motor designs. With costs mounting during the First World War, a cheaper alternative was sought in the form of rail motors. The first trial was the Kerr-Stewart steam-powered railcar, of which only one was built. It ran for some years, being built in 1912 and then scrapped in 1927, but was no success. The first petrol-powered rail car used by the Victorian Railways was the extremely strange-looking and oddly futuristic McKean railcar. These were not successful by any stretch of the imagination, as they were built in 1912, withdrawn in 1915, and then de-engined in 1919 and used on the Altona line in Melbourne as passenger rolling stock. Then, in 1922, the Victorian Railways found some success with a decent rail motor. The oddly charming little AEC rail motor was essentially a bus mounted on broad gauge bogies and left to scamper around Victoria's railway network. It was, considering the two previous failures, a success, as 19 were built between 1922 and 1925. They would go on to still be in service in the early 1950s. Then, preceding the AEC rail motor was the Leyland rail motor. Only 4 were built as temporary replacements for the McKean railcars, and I must say, compared to the McKean railcars, these are much better looking. Though Leylands too served into the 1950s, with all 4 examples being built in 1927. Despite the success of the AEC rail motor, the Victorian Railways needed something a bit bigger, more powerful and more comfortable than the AEC. And now I am going to talk about the vehicle you all came to see. The Derm. This was the first major success the Victorian Railways had with a conventional rail motor. The first design was based on the Electromotive Corporation's rail motor, used by the Great Northern Railroad in the United States. The Great Northern Railroad's design was first assembled for the Electromotive Corporation in the St. Louis Car Company and proved to be cheaper than locomotive-hauled services, as well as being faster between the stops compared to loco-hauled services. Victorian Railways imported and locally sourced the parts to build the very first of their PERMs, as initially the Derms were powered by petrol engines as opposed to the later diesel engines. The assembly of the first PERM began in 1928 in Newport workshops. The PERMs were initially fitted with Winton Company 220 horsepower petrol engines. In 1928, Victorian Railways began construction of the production variant of the PERM, with only 9 being constructed between 1929 and 1931. The machines themselves are of a wooden construction. The Winton Company's engines were 6-cylinder, 220 horsepower petrol engines, and can propel the rail motor up to 60 miles per hour, or for us metric addicts, 100 kilometers per hour. The cars weighed in at just 43 tonnes, making them ideal for rural branch lines and suburban commutes. They were fairly comfortable for passengers, of which it could hold 61. They also had the benefit of a guard and baggage compartment, separated cab for the driver at either end of the car, again increasing the efficiency over the AEC rail motor. The Perms ran throughout the 30s and 40s with little to no modifications. By the 1950s, the Winton petrol engines must have been getting on a bit in age, as the Victorian Railways upgraded the Perms into Derms by fitting them with two General Motors 6-cylinder 71 series engines, giving now 275 horsepower as opposed to 220 horsepower in the petrol engine. The rail motors were beginning to age at this point. All were still in service and all were above 40 years old. Some attempts were made to upgrade the Derms, with RM56's interior being extensively modified and rearranged, but these upgrades would prove useless. By the late 1970s, RM56, RM55 and RM61 were extensively modified, their bodies lengthened, new seating arrangement and engines relocated. This trio of Derms were known as the Super Derms. These Super Derms are visually very different from the unmodified Derms. As the decades dragged on, the Victorian Railways changed and turned and modified itself into V-Line. So what became of the Derms? Well, unlike the AEC rail motors or even the Walker rail motors, the Derms were never scrapped en masse or even withdrawn altogether. From what I've seen in my research, some Derms lasted until the 1990s, more than likely wearing the V-Line livery, which I could find no photographs of. All but one of the Derms were preserved, the unlucky Derm being 57RM, scrapped in 1982. The disposition of the remaining 9 cars is scattered to say the least, with 3 examples restored and operational. One at the Daylesford Spa Railway, where my footage and photos were taken, one on the Victorian Goldfields Railway in Malden, and one stored at Newport, where it's operated by the, well, it's a very long name, just bear with me, the Petrol Electric Rail Motor Preservation Association of Victoria, or as I will call it, DermPav. The rest of the faithful Derms are either pending restoration, stored, or cannibalised for parts. The Derms were a comparative success, and although small in numbers, lived very long lives, trundling around Victoria. Overall, I really like the Derms. If you visit the tourist country town of Daylesford of a Sunday, you can ride 63RM at the Daylesford Spa Railway. Please do, it's a charming heritage line operated by a dedicated group of volunteers, and with an extensive collection of rolling stock as well. Compared to what came before, the Derms were very competent machines and served for well over 60 years, even outlasting the more modern Walker rail motors of the 1950s. Anyway, I'm Charles, this is Corporal Charles, and thank you for watching. They've torn up the loop, and there's only a scar to show where the water crane stood. But the birch and the elder still follow the track, standing black in the smoke and the rain. And the poor little sheep with a small...